thank you for joining us. This is Brave New History. I'm here with Matt VanWinkle. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
So let's see, you're part of the Barely Saved podcast.
Yes.
And yeah, you have a background, you have a bachelor's degree in.
Youth ministries. Yep.
Okay, brilliant.
Youth and student ministries. So depends on whichever one you need me to do.
Yep, can't beat it. So yeah, what's your background and what are your favorite subjects?
Yeah, I grew up in church. I was a pastor's kid, so I've been in and around ministry most of my life. I grew up very inquisitive and wanted to be a chemist, but then organic chemistry just got me. I don't know. There's something about bond angles that I just don't care about, and so that scared me off enough. Um, and I just started studying and just wanted to keep going. Just felt like there was more out there that I wasn't quite getting, if you will. People would say something and I'd be like, listen, I don't know what you're talking about, but tell me more. And so as I went, I just kept diving deeper and worked, joined the army for a little bit. And of course, then they give you free money to go to school, which is wonderful. So I finished up my bachelor's degree and then was like, well, I've got more. Maybe I should keep going. Started my master's degree, learned a lot in that. And once I got finished with that, it was more of a now I want to keep going some more. And thought about PhD programs for a long time. Had my spreadsheet like any good nerd, and uh, where was I going to apply? Where did I want to live? What were the stipends going to be like? Trying to figure out what that would look like. And while doing all of that, the doctorate in ministry and New Testament context at Northern Seminary opened up, and the chance to study with Scott McKnight was just something I couldn't pass up. And so fortunately I got in with a couple of friends, and we have been on that journey now for a while. So I've written in that coursework a little bit about sin. I've written about Paul's view. No, what was my first paper? I can't remember now. Man, that was a long time ago and totally blanking on it. But I wrote about Nicodemus. I just finished a paper for an additional class in theology on Marx's statement that religion is the opiate of the masses or of the people, in which I argue that, yes, that is true. Like, duh. But that's not the problem. The problem is when religion is the opiate of the oppressors, where when they get to a point where they can the oppressive class can use religion to make themselves feel better, that's when religion really does its damage the most. So I thought it was really good. Don't know what my professor thinks yet, but we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, and a lot of people misunderstand that quote, where he's essentially saying it's the Excedrin for the people, where he's talking favorably of religion, saying that
he's saying it's a great. It makes people that, and especially for Marx, religion does not mean religion; it means Christianity, right? Because that's what he's embedded in that culture. So yeah, Christianity gives people hope. It gives the masses hope that there's a resurrection, that there's something going to happen later, that some sort of vindication, some sort of rescue that will happen. So yeah, but people see it, like you said, as such a negative. I hope I vindicated it in the paper. We'll see.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, where it's just that we use the word opium just seems like, like now it seems like you're into hard drugs, right? Whereas previous, that was like if you had a killer headache, you should maybe take some opium.
Well, and it was a hard paper for me to write. Like, you know how sometimes you do something and then afterwards you're looking back and you're like, oh, that was like troubling my soul. I went back and read some primary sources about racism in the United States, and it hits different when you're
Hmm.
reading prime. It's one thing to read Color of Compromise. It's one thing to read The New Jim Crow. It's one thing to read White Evangelical Racism. It's one thing to read those secondary books. Even Martin Noll's Theological Crisis or Civil War's Theological Crisis. But when you start reading those primary sources for the same, it's soul crushing. Like it hits different.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I know like examples of Abraham Lincoln, which we all think of him as a hero, right? He would
Yeah.
still say stuff like, "Oh no, I'm still a white supremacist," right?
Yeah.
Which you wonder how to take it because everybody like there's that famous quip that he said where Stephen Douglas accused him of being two-faced, and then he says, "Well, if I have two faces, do you think I'd go around with this one?" Because he was not a looker, you know.
Yeah.
And everybody accused him of like, he would always say that, no, no, we're not trying to end slavery. We're just trying to end the spread of slavery. And then after that caught on, they did in fact choose to end slavery. And then he was like, right before he was killed, was like, no, no, we're not talking about full civil rights, right? And
Yeah.
then he was killed. So it makes
And
me
then
believe that he wasn't sincere when he called himself a white supremacist, that he was just saying that to because that was
he would
his how he yeah.
he would appease, and for like I don't remember what year it was, but obviously the slaves in Washington were emancipated. And when the slaves in Washington were emancipated, because it basically was eminent domain, you could file with the federal government to
Mhm.
get paid for the loss of property if you were a
Yeah.
white slave owner. And of course, if you were a slave, you got nothing. You were just like, yeah, sorry, hopefully you make it.
Yeah. Yeah, no. Yeah. And that's how the UK did it. And that kind of went on without really much of a that they just said, okay, here's your money. We're eminent domaining them now. But in the American South, they didn't go for that. They could have been paid big money, but instead they chose to do it the hard way and got no money. Uh,
Yep.
but
And some
yeah, and then
some cities just burned, as
yeah,
they do.
yeah, that's how it happened. But it's your choice. We're here by your invitation, right?
Yeah.
And then we had 40 Acres and a Mule, right? Which after Lincoln died, that went away, unfortunately. Where I thought that was a really good way to kind of, I don't
It
know,
was
kind of sort us
certainly
out.
something. Yeah, at least it would have been a while maybe not enough, it would have been something to prop people up and give them a chance. But that's not the American way, no matter how much we want to think it might be.
That is true, isn't it? Like, I don't know. It's like for some reason we think life has got to be tough, and oh, it's just does it though? I mean, I don't know. Like,
It's hard for me to have an opinion on that as someone who comes from extreme privilege. Like I was never rich by any stretch of the imagination. Like we were on, you know, I was on Medicaid when I was a kid, all those things. But at the same time, both of my parents had bachelor's degrees, and so I've always felt like very privileged in those senses. I mean, like my daughter's in high school, and they're going through the stuff, and there's the class. I don't know, it's special, but there's a class for people who are like first generation, want to go to college, right, to give them the skill set necessary. And I looked at my kid, I was like, you can't take that class. Like you need to leave some seats for people who need that, because I can guarantee you I can navigate through anything that comes. I've been there. I got you. um and just that is just a lot of privilege my direction. So does America think it has to be hard? Probably, but I don't know. Maybe it's hard for me to
Yeah.
have an opinion on it.
Yeah. Where, yeah, I think with the Civil War, I think the South got off really, really easy. I mean, even with Sherman, right? I think that, I mean, I think everybody got off easy. That more people should have been sent to prison. Um, and if we just followed through with 40 Acres and a Mule, it would have made the whole um, reparations deal so much easier, because now we're generations away, and like,
Right.
how do we sort that out?
What,
Um,
and you wouldn't have, the flight to the north like you did, because people would have had something to stay for. Whereas afterwards, the flight to the north, and then the north, while maybe anti-slavery, was not anti-racism.
yeah,
Um, and in fact, may have been, it's just such a different racism too. But yeah, I mean, the biggest Klan rallies were, not in the South, but in Indiana and Illinois. So it's, you never know what could have been had we actually followed through with a halfway decent plan.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And if Lincoln would have stayed alive, I
Oh,
bet
right.
he would have been like the civil rights leader. I bet. But who knows? Maybe he was racist as he said he was. But part of me thinks like there was a pattern of, like I said, like, oh no, we're not going to do that, and then that's the very next thing he does.
That's just good
So
politics, right?
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah. So how did we get on that? But we've got,
Marx, I
what's
think.
that?
I think it had to be Marx. Always Marx.
Okay, yeah, Marx and religion. Yeah, and even though you're politically liberal, you're theologically more maybe conservative, you would say.
Yeah, yeah. I definitely live on a more liberal side of um, the political spectrum, because I just I feel personally that a lot of times if we want the government to do things, I'd rather it do good things than nothing. Which is not necessarily how I grew up in a or a culturally, politically conservative um, area. Um, but yeah, theologically, I still remain rather conservative compared to um, other theologians, or even other biblical scholars. Just I'm a little more serious about the text than most people. Um, I try to take it seriously as even a guide for myself. Um, I don't necessarily agree all the times with the interpretations of others. So there are
Mhm.
times where I will be accused of a more liberal interpretation. However, um, just because the interpretation might be a little more liberal doesn't mean that I don't take the text seriously. And so I've found generally that if you take the text seriously, those in the guild will say, "Yeah, you're just a conservative." So I don't think I fall to the fundamentalist side on either end of the spectrum. I tend to be more toward the middle, but most people would still throw me over there with the crazy conservatives.
Yeah, which I mean, is interesting, because I think in Acts they seem to be promoting full on communism,
Hmm.
and the Didache seems to be expressly, no, this isn't metaphorical. We mean real communism. And,
Yep.
I would put personally the Didache before Paul, which I think that's kind of the trajectory where the scholarship is kind of going. And yeah, it's weird that when we take the Bible literally, we seem to be talking about hell and damnation and very conservative views. But I
Right.
think if you were to take the Bible literally, you would be a card-carrying communist trying to create kibbutzes
Yeah, all
and
over the place.
yeah.
I think that I mean, I've had this discussion multiple times. Um, having read Marx, not all of Marx, but enough to be dangerous, I guess. Um, I think the issue that I have is I don't think he's wrong when he's identifying the problem, right? The problem isn't uh, a nebulous issue. It's that power concentrates in the hands of a few, and that those few do what they need to stay in power, right? And we even see this in church history. Like, why do we have three popes? Because they all want the power. Which one of them is going to be like, no, no, friends, I will be the humble one and step down. No, they've all, they're there because they believe that the power in their hands will do the best. Um, and so I don't think that Marx is incorrect about power and wealth being, those things that are hoarded and held on to. I do think that Marx is generally incorrect in how he thinks we should solve the problem.
Mhm.
Um, coming from a Christian perspective, I think that, like, yes, it is the giving of all, but it's inside that Christian community where it's easily done because we all have a shared telos and we all have a shared eschatology that, like, this is how it's going to end eventually. So we might as well all come together and share. Um, but yeah, I don't like, I read the Communist Manifesto, especially that first part of it, and before he starts to get to his solution. And I'm just hearing Hosea and Obadiah and Micah and Amos just in my head, screaming about the injustices that are done at the hands of the rich and powerful. And it's really hard for me not to put those two together. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you're gonna take the text seriously, right? It's how do you take the text seriously when God says, "Care for the widow, the orphan, and the alien"? And if you're not taking those texts seriously, that means you're picking and choosing. And I feels like those are the ones I'd rather pick and choose to apply and take seriously. What do I know?
Yeah. Yeah. I remember, I think it was a YouTube video where they were playing is it from the Communist Manifesto or is it from the Bible? And you
Oh
were
yeah,
to hear the quote and then pick whether it's from the Communist Manifesto or from it's from the Bible. And
yeah,
that was really hard, right? Because you have to say, this sounds like Jesus, but it's just like you'd have to memorize the New Testament to really know for sure because
yeah. I mean, it goes
it's
back to that idea. Like, Marx is swimming in a culture of Christianity that, he's not ignorant of what the text says is the problem, and he grasps onto that more than anything. He just comes up with a different solution than I would.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And let's see, maybe we'll find some kind of tie-in to the woman caught in adultery
Yeah,
from what we've been talking
it
about.
can't be too hard,
But,
right?
well, I mean, I'm struggling, but how would you
Hold on, I
read into
gotta.
it?
There's I gotta pull up the paper because there is a tie-in. I believe. Just gotta think about how I would do it.
Well, I guess let's say there's like a church disciplinary meeting, and a woman was caught in adultery. It would never end today, even though it's expressly said in John, that's how it is, that's how Jesus would do it. It would never end by saying, you know what, just don't sin anymore,
Yeah, just
and we'll
go.
just end it there.
We'll call it even. Yeah, it's certainly we are definitely more into the the judgment at hand than we are anything else. Yeah. So I think speaking of this wonderful little section, um, I don't know. Have you seen the blog article that Dan Wallace wrote about the woman caught in adultery?
No.
So Dan Wallace, if you're not familiar with who he is a text critic. He is one of I mean, I would say one of the best in the world. Um, People know his name in the text
Mhm.
critical field. So text criticism being, hey, we're going to look at all these manuscripts, try to figure out which one is most like the original. Um, and Dan just straight up says, I am calling for translators to remove this text from the Gospel of John and relegate it to the footnotes. He is so convinced that it's not a part of the original that, we shouldn't have it in there. And I feel like at times I felt the same way. I don't know about you. Um, Probably in my more fundamentalist moments. Really
Mhm.
drilling down and being like, yeah, it's not supposed to be there kind of thing. But I was reading, I was doing some research on Nicodemus specifically, and I kept reading the way that John was talking about sin in other areas, and then also the way that he talks about Nicodemus, and like it all came together, and I'm just like, there's more here in this story than just a story. And additionally, this year I've decided to read through N.T. Wright's Christian Origin series, um, which may or may not have been a mistake already, but we'll see how that goes. I'm already crying, and I'm not even halfway through the first book. But he often talks about how stories are very influential in the life of humanity, right? And one of my favorite like ideas about this is This American Life, the
Mhm.
podcast, um, because they don't just tell you what's up; they show you the data and then they tell you the story. So the one I remember the most is um, The Problem We All Live With. Came out in 2015, and it had to do with race and schools. And they're throwing out data left and right. But the thing that grips you is this girl's story who went to the same high school that Michael Brown graduated from. And the state of Missouri closed it down because it was so bad. And so they ended up having to bus these kids across town to another high school. And this kid's like an A student, but the crowd there is all they're like, oh, are we gonna put up metal detectors? Like they're just really concerned about what these black students are gonna bring. And while they're telling you this, they're telling you the stories of like, hey, when schools are integrated, lower performing students increase their scores. And upper higher performing students, they don't decrease. Like there's a rise. And the story and the data together change your mind. So I've been that's one of those things you just sit and you think about. And then I came across this. I don't remember what I was doing, but Elliot, have you heard of March Mammal Madness?
No.
Okay, so you've heard of March Madness, right? The
Basketball?
NCAA basketball
Yeah.
tournament. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
So imagine, if you will, instead of basketball teams, you put mammals in a bracket. Okay.
Okay.
And now you can fill out your bracket. And then additionally, there is a Twitter page that instead of sharing lists of animal facts or relegating outcomes to a process of voting, March Mammal Madness scientist narrators present facts embedded in suspenseful descriptions of combatants' offensive and defensive maneuvers as though observing such a counter in real time. Now, granted, these are like two animals who would never meet, right? but they wrote a paper, because why wouldn't they, on how the narrative and gamification of facts contribute to a greater understanding for the learner. So these stories that they're telling about these fictional animal battles all of a sudden come together, and they're like, oh, people are learning more because we're telling them a story, right? So we got this
Mhm.
idea from This American Life. This paper, which does a great job, the paper is intense. I can send you a link later.
Mhm.
It's not one that the normal person should read, if you know what I mean. You have to be a certain level of nerd. But all of this swirling around brought me back to what's happening with the woman at the well. Or not the woman at the well, sorry. Although that is important in my argument. It's not, we're not talking about it as much. But the way that John writes about the woman caught in adultery, or doesn't write, somebody writes. And the connection that I started to see was in chapter 8, verse verse 7, where Jesus says, I do not condemn you either. Go from now and do not sin anymore. Well, this isn't the first time we've seen this verb. Now, granted, the verb here, the condemn verb, is not simply the same as the other two. So we talked about this a little bit before we were talking, and that the grammar here, the language is a little higher than John's, right? So it's katakrino instead of just krino. The other two times, though, is in John 3:17, when Jesus is talking to Nicodemus. He said, for God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world should be saved through him. And then he also says the same thing in 47, John 12:47 through 48. If anyone hears my words but does not obey them, I do not judge him. There it is again. For I have not come to judge the world, but to save the world. The one who rejects me and does not accept my words has a judge. The word I have spoken will judge him at that day. Again, both judgment, condemnation, crino verbs, both actually use the same sozo. They're linked even more than that. So when you look at John 3, 3:19 through 21, so right after that 3:17 passage, it says, now this is the basis for judging, that the light has come into the world. People love the darkness rather than the light. He goes on. A lot of light language, right?
Mhm.
And then in verse 35 to 36, so a little bit before that 47 passage, it says, the light is with you for a little while longer while you have the light. So again, we're having that light passage, right? And it's meant to evoke back to that John 3 story. Additionally, the John 8 story is Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, right? So he's coming in for that Passover feast. And then in John chapter 2, so right before his conversation with Nicodemus, he is there for it's him cleansing the temple. It's John's temple
Mhm.
cleansing. So again, both of them are happening in and around Jerusalem. Both of them have that light conversation. Both of them have this condemnation language. You know, it's all there. So if we finally then move to this, the woman caught in adultery, John 7:28 tells us Jesus is at the temple. Now, the pericope adulterae specifically is said to have happened on the Mount of Olives, but the section right before that, Jesus is in the temple. In verse 50, Nicodemus shows up to defend Jesus, right? So Nicodemus appears 3 times in the gospel. John chapter 3, here in John 7, and then in John chapter 20. I don't think it's 21. It has to be 20, right? So here's a link to Nicodemus in there. And then right after, so again, but they're all in Jerusalem, right? Nicodemus is there for the first 2. And then directly after the pericope adulterae, right? The next words that Jesus says that people consider authentic to John is, I am the light of the world. The one who follows me will never walk in darkness, but have the light of life. A huge I am statement, right? In the
Mhm.
book of John. And it specifically is, I am the light of the world, which then ties it back to John chapter 3, where he talks about light, and John chapter 12, where we have the light language again. So the narrative context of of these three pericopes, there's something in the water. I can't tell you that it's for sure these are all supposed to be linked, but there's enough in here linking them that's like, okay, something's happening, right?
Hmm.
So what is he doing with the pericope dulce? I think that just like those stories we talked about earlier, truly narrate and tell, like they provide more information than me just telling you, hey, the stats on Black education are this. No, let's tell a story about it. It's not simply platypus has a venom fang or venom claw on its back web foot. I don't know. What is it? What would you call that on a platypus? Who knows? But it's the narrative that surrounds it. So John has this idea that Jesus has come to save, not to condemn. And he says it in 3 and 12. And so someone saw all that language with Nicodemus, the temple, the light, and they remembered a story about Jesus not condemning but
Hmm.
saving. And so they put that story there. And it's so powerful and it's so vivid in the Christian imagination because it shows Jesus doing this. It doesn't merely say, Jesus isn't walking around saying, yeah, I came to do this. We all know those people in our lives who will definitely tell you what they're here for, but then they never are doing that. And this is that story which is meant to take the words that Jesus is saying and show that he's actually doing it. And so, while I don't think anyone on this planet will argue that that section of scripture is original to John's gospel, I think that Dan Wallace is wrong because I think whoever put it there did so because narrative tells us a story that simple words cannot, and that whoever put it there didn't just slap it in the middle of John. They did so knowing where the narrative was, where it was going, and put it exactly where it needs to be.
And you'd think just by not being in the earliest manuscripts and then appearing, right, before, I think before it's in John, it's in Luke,
Mm-hmm.
that maybe creates a better case for historicity, being that it doesn't appear there and it appears previously in Luke, that maybe it's just a floating story, right? Just a standalone thing that might have been part of the oral tradition, right?
Yeah. Oh, and
Although,
we know that the oral tradition surrounding Jesus, if John is to be trusted, and I think there's reasons to trust John, just the number of things that they knew about Jesus and had said about Jesus were far more than what we have on pages. Paper's
yeah,
expensive, man. You're not
yeah,
you're not writing everything down in the Greco-Roman world. Like you're writing down the things. You're telling a selective story to do a selective thing, and we know that all the gospel writers do that. Because they even change what each other has said to tell their story better. So it definitely seems like you mentioned, this exists out there in this oral tradition. It just finally got put, and we know it got put somewhere, and it seems it got put here.
yeah, yeah, and probably in the wider setup for John, right? How it mirrors Genesis, right? Where you
Hmm.
have the
Yeah.
in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, right? That's the opening of Genesis. And you'd wonder if there's an Old Testament parallel to this story that I can't think of one, but maybe there is
So
because
yeah, we didn't. Like I said with the woman at the well, I write about this in my paper on the subject, but the
yeah,
woman at the well is John continuing that motif as well, right?
continuing
Um,
what?
Continuing the woman at the well motif. So Isaac doesn't exist in the Bible, really. He's just kind of like there. So Abraham's servant goes to find Isaac a wife. He goes to a well, asks her for water. She gives him water. They get married. Jacob runs away from his dad, goes to a well, sees a pretty girl, helps her get water. They get married, right? And then in Exodus, Moses is running from Pharaoh, sees a pretty girl, gets some water, and they get married. So what is
Mhm.
John's audience primed to hear when
They
Jesus
get married, yeah.
goes to Jacob's well? It's not even like he's hiding what he's doing.
Oh,
Like
got it, got
he's
it.
like, she says, "Our father Jacob dug this well." Like, come on. What is John? He is saying they're going to get married. And then what? My favorite part. What does Jesus ask her? Go get your husband, right? Like, you're still primed to hear this in that story. Like,
Mhm,
it's still right there. And she's like, you can almost hear her flirtatiously expecting and saying, "Oh, I don't have a husband," right?
mhm.
Like, "Oh, a man is meeting me at Jacob's well. Let's go." Everyone's swiping right here. Like, we're
Mhm.
we're in it. And then he says, "You're right. The man you're living with isn't your husband. You've had 5, and now here's where you are." And the conversation changes at that point, right? Everything switches on a dime. But what John is doing is he's pulling from that Old Testament consistent narrative to then to grab the reader, um, to use that narrative grab to pull them in and then hit them with the punch of who Jesus is. Yeah.
Yeah, and so we're saying that, in terms of the woman taken in adultery, it kind of the woman at the well mirrors that story,
Hmm.
and maybe the woman taken in adultery is also kind of rooted in that, the woman at the well motif in the Old Testament?
I think there's something there. I think it also shows that um, John is John patterns things as well. John doesn't just John doesn't just like say something. John always says something because something else happened, or like there's always a tie-in, right? You don't get the Nicodemus conversation happening at night is important because the next thing you see is the woman at the well at noon. But, right there's that juxtaposition there, and him of the Pharisees of the line who's supposed to understand what's happening, and her being a Samaritan and of course ignorant of all that you can imagine. So John doesn't do things on accident. Um, and so there's something, I don't know what it is between the woman at the well and the woman caught in adultery. I don't know if it's obviously there's space between them too. So whoever put that
Mhm.
in there might have considered that. Um, and I also think for modern readers, the woman caught in adultery and the woman at the well get confused.
Yeah.
I mean, I
Well, then
fumbled it earlier, right? So yeah,
also, Mary Magdalene gets conflated,
yep, yep. And
which
we don't know
yeah.
who this woman is, right? It, it's hard to imagine that they only ever found one woman committing adultery in Jerusalem.
Mhm.
You know, that's not how humans are. So it makes you wonder how that story was construed. But yeah, I think it's very important. And like you said, there could be, when you talk about it, like the story of Phineas in Numbers, right, where there's a man with a foreign woman, and he jabs the spear through both of them. That story comes to mind. Um, Joseph with Potiphar's wife comes to mind as like a motif of the similar. Um, yeah. So John's definitely pulling, or whoever that story itself is pulling from somebody and then putting it there is definitely a part of, I think, John's overall beauty.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of my favorites that, and that at the end, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. Where it's very like that's the tearjerker moment, right?
Hmm. Yeah. So much power, right? So much. It's the tearjerker because it's a story. You don't get that way on John 3:17. Like, I didn't come to condemn the world, but to save it. Like, okay, whatever, sure, Jesus. No, you feel that when there's somebody involved. There's a person you can attach that emotion to. Yeah, yeah, I think it's huge, and I think that whoever put it there did so on purpose. And I'm at one point in my life, I don't think I would have ever used it to preach or teach. Um, but at this point, I've turned a corner, and
Yeah.
I think I would. And somebody asked me when I presented the paper, uh, why would they keep again that Crino being different? Why would they keep the Catacrino and not change it to Crino? And I think part of it might be because to me that lends itself to being added to the gospel. That
Right.
the language is different, and that they didn't adjust what they knew. Um, they were just putting what they thought belonged there.
Yeah. Or, I mean, if we're maybe going to go off into maybe conspiracy theory territory where there's the proto John, right?
Yeah,
And like it's maybe not, I mean, there's not really a straight up miracle that happened, so it's maybe not in the signs gospel.
right.
But where it seems that Mark is responding to John, right? But we know that can't be because John is much later. Maybe this was, I don't know, like an earlier tradition where when we're kind of lumping things together, I don't know how that would work on like the manuscript wise, if that could legit hold up. But you wonder if this is kind of very early, right, where we're kind of smashing the
Yeah,
various versions of John together. Yeah, but I mean, yeah, the author or the editor of John really sees that we have to put that in there, right? And just with not changing the verbiage to agree with the
yeah,
rest of John might seem that no, this is legit a historical piece, right? So if we're going to edit it, we're going to be off because like the wording is probably as good as it gets here.
and one of those textual critic ideas is that we go with the more difficult reading sometimes, and I don't think I don't think that the fact that the verbs disagree, quote unquote,
Mhm.
is necessarily a negative. I think if I were to write and present the paper again, I might include that as part of the conversation a little more. Um, but I don't think that it harms the argument. Um, it I think it's neutral, right? it's it's indifferent to a certain extent because you could see it definitely being like, why didn't they just change the verb? That makes a lot more sense. But also, well, why would they change the verb? Like, it doesn't make sense to change the verb um, if it's in close agreement.
Mhm.
So, yeah, it's an interesting piece of the puzzle, though, for sure.
Yeah, and it's kind of the opposite of uh, you know uh, a critical view of it, where you could answer why didn't they change the verb? Well, because that's the actual words that he said. Like that, like I mean, you
Right?
can make that case because that's what the editor of John thought is because,
Yeah.
well, no, we're not going to make it fit in there because like we believe that this is legit historical. So why did he use that verb? Because that's what he chose to say. That's what actually was. You could almost make that case.
Yeah. I mean, we're dealing with the only thing we have are the words on the page, right? So we can we have to theorize about it because that's all we get. Like, we don't. This isn't one of those where, oh, the synoptic, like you said, it moves around, but it's not like
Mhm.
we can compare it to a synoptic passage and say, what did John change? Why did John change what he changed to make his point? Um, you can do that with like the 5,000 feeding of the 5,000, but because this doesn't exist anywhere else, you can't do the same comparison.
Yeah, and it's a wonder that it doesn't. And we'd almost wonder, doesn't it? Like we would expect it to kind of resonate with later gospels, right? That like with like the other mystical versions of John, right?
Right?
We would expect to see it because like when you're more antinomian, you would love to have this in there, right?
Yeah,
But it doesn't, as far as I know. We don't see it. Maybe it's more because it's I don't know. The Gnostics didn't think necessarily, as far as I know, highly of women, so they would just be like, "Yeah, we're not include. This is a girl story. We're not including it." I don't know,
that's true.
but
Yeah. And
but
of course, we don't see it consistently in John. I think till the 4th century. Um, that doesn't mean that it's not there earlier. It's just that we don't
got
have
it,
those
got it.
manuscripts as much. Um, I think
Yeah, so not maybe the Gnosticism has run its course by the time that it's included in.
in theory, yes, of course, it always seems to come back in random forms. But yes, the 2nd century version probably had already burned its steam out.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, one question that's kind of mysterious is, have you thought about why he's writing in the sand? And what do you think he's writing?
Of course, the standard evangelical answer is he's writing down all their sins in the sand. Um,
That seems unlike Jesus to.
right. And very much unlike how he finishes the story, too, right?
Yeah,
um, I cannot remember where I read it, and I don't know if I trust it.
yeah,
But there was a story of a rabbi doing something like this
yeah.
and almost like stalling for time, right? I heard this TikTok the other day talking about like if you're in a teaching capacity or if you're in a place where you want to get responses, um, if you ask a question, wait 7 seconds. Which, if you've ever just waited for 7 seconds, my goodness, it is the longest period of silence you feel like you've ever felt in your entire life, right? So it makes me wonder if that's kind of what Jesus is doing in the moment. Um, like you bend down, so these all these people have come up to you with stones, right? In theory, and you bend down, and instead of doing what they expect, which is picking up a stone, you start doodling in the sand, and it makes me wonder if it's just a stall tactic, right? To subvert expectations. Um, to go back to the Genesis idea, like what if it's just reminding them, hey, dust to dust, you know? Um, that has a lot of powerful, like if you were doing that and that's the intention, like that's a very powerful, thought-provoking, like, what do you mean you want to kill this woman because she did this? Like, what happens when you die? Like don't just think about you're missing what the law is attempting to do here, which is not to end life, but to preserve it. Like, you guys have just totally blown it. Let me remind you what the law says, from dust to dust.
hmm
And so, whether that was consciously on Jesus's mind, I don't know. But it's entirely possible. Like, this is a philosopher
hmm
who was really good at philosophizing. So, yeah, any of those options are open. I don't think, though, that he was writing their sins down in the sand. I don't think that that's the best reading of that one.
Yeah. You wonder. I mean, you've probably heard the idea that he's writing the law in the sand,
Hmm.
right? Whereas previously the law was written in stone. Now we'll write it in sand. That would be like
Yeah, that's an interesting
quite a
idea.
way.
I'm trying to think through. Part of the problem is when you have a passage like this that is very definitely not Johannine, how then are you evaluating the passage, right? Like, if this was Paul, I could give you a really good answer. But it's not. It's a Jesus story, and so I have to figure out, like, how do you tell this within the Jesus story? I find it hard to imagine that that is the intention, primarily because the the story, the Jesus story itself, does not lend itself to one who is attempting to change something in that manner. I mean, I'm so deep in the new perspective and trying to understand how the Torah was thought of, that, like, I don't think that, like, Pharisees, I'll say Pharisees because I don't want to go further than that, but I don't think the Pharisees thought that it was anything other than life-giving. And Jesus being probably more fair of the Pharisee class than anything, it's hard for me to
Mhm.
imagine that he would do something like that. I still think that Jesus believes that the law gives life. But it's how the law gives life was always the question. Um, and I think this is part of that conversation. It's
Yeah.
also interesting in the story itself. Um, so it's clearly not the Pharisees that are doing this. Um, the Pharisees are hilarious because they are some of the most liberal people in the Bible, because they're like, no, yeah, sure, the law says death, but it really means just excommunication, right? They're all about trying to not follow the punishments of the law as much as possible and try to make the rules of the law as easy to follow as they can. Um, so when they come, it's hard for me to imagine that this is a group like that, because they wouldn't put to death someone if they could avoid it. So this test has to come from a different set of individuals. And I don't think, I'm going to look it up real quick because it's been a minute. But I don't think the text has the Pharisees bringing this individual. Yeah, it does. It's the teacher of the law and the Pharisees, which is really funny because it almost lends to its historical inaccuracy, because that's just not the
Mhm.
Pharisees. They wouldn't kill somebody for that. Not the historical Pharisees. So.
Yeah, and I guess that also is a a tick in favor of how it's actually like John to be included,
Yeah.
because the Pharisees were always terrible, terrible people, and Jesus was the opposite of them.
Yeah, what's really funny to me, one of the things that makes Nicodemus as a story um, seem more authentic, is when it's in the previous, in chapter 7, where he says, does our law condemn a man without first hearing him to find out what he has been doing? Like, Nicodemus is like, listen, you guys, come on, get it together. We know better. Um, and it seems as if their zeal for whatever in John is definitely heightened to try to do things that would be uncharacteristic of it normally.
Yeah, well, you wonder if that's kind of the frame where the story is brought in, right? So you wonder if that's John, because it seems really Johannine until then. So you wonder if there's a different context on which we have the woman taken in adultery in the earlier story, just being
Yeah, it
text
makes you
critical.
wonder. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's described as being in a cave. Yeah.
So it's a little confusing. So Jesus goes to the Mount of Olives uh, in verse 1, and then at dawn he appeared in the temple courts again, and all the people gathered around as he sat to teach. So he's sitting in the seat of the teacher. And then the teachers and the Pharisees brought her in. So here's the question. How much sand is in the temple courts, right? Like, because this, now granted, this is a New International Version, but it does say that he just wrote on the ground with his finger. Like, what does that mean? How does one write on the ground with their finger unless there is something to write in? Of course, we've consistently, kind of made that sand. But what if he's like, gets his finger wet and then starts writing, and then it slowly disappears? I don't know. It definitely changes, like the conversation we had earlier about sand. Like, what does it mean when he does that? Yeah,
Yeah.
it's such a weird story, right? And that's part of the thing is like, because it's not original to John, like to what I said earlier, it's really hard to read it in light of John. You can't go to it and say, well, if he's writing in the ground now, what does John say elsewhere? Well, it doesn't matter, because if it's not original, then it wasn't a part of the original narrative, and you have to take the story as its own. I don't enjoy generally taking stories as their own little pericopes, right?
Mhm.
I don't know if you can tell that, but like, I'm talking about the woman at the well. I'm looking at uh Isaac, or not Isaac, yeah, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses, right? Which thanks to my Old Testament survey professor for pointing that out. When you're looking at the woman at the well and Nicodemus, right? There's juxtaposition there, right? I tend to look at I try to look at the books themselves, the letters, whatever, as whole units, and then even try to figure out how do they fit as part of the whole. This passage just resists that so much, right? Who do you look at Luke like you mentioned, or do you just have to look at it compared to other Jesus stories? Do you have to look at it as its own pericope? There's so many more questions when you get to it than anything else.
Yeah. And you wonder, so yeah, I guess I just envisioned it like without reading the fuller context as, like I said, in a cave, because I guess
Yeah.
that's where you would get sand, but then you'd be in the, I don't know, but that's just the context I envisioned it in, I guess. But so we're in
Well,
the,
it's like it's a very similar to the day of Pentecost, right? Like, where do you envision, if I say the day of Pentecost, where do you envision that happening?
in a house.
There's no way they're at a house, right? Like, think about what it says. They go to the temple every day to pray.
Yeah.
Like, we know this is what they do. It's 9:00, right? Where are they? They're at the temple. How did 3,000 people see tongues of fire and hear these people talking inside? Were they yelling inside the house?
Yeah.
And
Well,
then
I
Peter comes
envisioned
out.
like a house party where some people are in the house, some people are
Some
outside.
people were just chilling outside. Maybe. But like, so I guess that's possible, but they're also scared, or in certain uh versions are scared, so they're all packed in the one room.
Hmm.
Makes so much more sense for them to be at the temple, right? So they're at the temple, all these things happen, and then Peter gets up. Where does he get up? At the temple. And it says they all got baptized. Well, where do they get baptized? In the mikvaots that are right outside the temple, right? That just makes like the story just comes together so more cohesively. And then
Hmm.
on top of that, once again, I don't know if you heard me say this 2 minutes ago, but like look at the whole story, right? The tabernacle, what happens? Flame and fire. What happens at the first temple? Flame and fire. What happens at the crowning of the temple of God, which is the church? Flame and wind at the temple, right? The glory of God has returned to the temple, except it's not in that building over there. It's now in the people where it belongs and should have been the whole time. The story makes so much more sense there. But because we've read the previous act story where they are in an upper room, we then, or in the house, right? The great room, we translate that to the next story because we just didn't think about it. But yeah,
Yeah.
I like the argument. I think it makes so much more sense that they're just at the temple next to.
Yeah. No, I think it does.
It doesn't place them anywhere, so I guess I can put them wherever I want.
Mhm. Yeah. And as we're talking that Jesus is kind of put into like a place of passing judgment, right? In
Yeah,
the temple.
yeah,
It almost you wonder if it's a callback to Solomon and the baby,
very much. So
right?
yeah, yeah, you're right. That is a great point.
Where kind of comes up with an unusual judgment, right?
And that's
Yeah,
something I haven't looked into as much. Jesus as wisdom in the book of John. But that's definitely something that someone, if it's not already out there, should be to talk about and go into depth on, like, how is Jesus presented as this wisdom figure as much in John, and how does this relate to that? I think to a certain extent, given the especially the farewell discourse, there's something there, but I don't know exactly what.
yeah, yeah, which would kind of fit, I guess. It would fit with John, I guess, if it's talking about Jesus as a Solomon figure. I guess it'd be more Johnine. So yeah, I guess it's not as a poor fit for John as we kind of thought it was at the outset.
And I want to point, I want to like triple down because I don't want anybody not taking it seriously. I am not saying that John wrote this, right? I don't.
Yeah.
That's not an argument that I am qualified to make, nor is it an argument that I think would be taken seriously. I just think that whoever put it there did so very purposefully and did so with an eye of an editor's eye. Like it wasn't, and of course this goes back to like, what does it mean to be a sacred text? And
Mhm,
you know,
mhm.
you asked earlier how I tend to be theologically conservative because I take the Bible seriously, but I also recognize that like Greek Esther exists and is considered, you know, a part of the text by some. So how then do we come to sacred text and say, no, 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 it's done. We can't add anything when that's not how the ancients viewed it. So it's definitely an interesting conversation. I'm not saying that I can add to the text, but um yeah, it's a it's an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, where he wasn't just trying to reach the minimum word count for the assignment.
Correct.
He
No,
had to
I
copy
have done
paste
that
it
before.
in. Yeah,
Let me see if I can cut and paste a part of another paper in here. Just cite myself.
yep, yep, very good. Yeah, and I mean, it makes sense because at the end, how it's talking about, I think we know his testimony is true. It's kind of saying that this is an edited compilation a bit
Oh
for
yeah, I mean
John. Yeah.
it's really funny because you get to the end, quote unquote, right of John and John chapter 20. Is that the part you're talking about?
Gosh,
So
I don't
the
remember.
end of John 20 and John 20 verse 30 says this. Now Jesus did many other things in the presence of his disciples that are not written in this book. We mentioned this a little earlier. But these are written so you may continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and through believing you may have life in his name. And after these things, so this is the next chapter, right? So it feels like it's got this nice little bow tie, like we're wrapped up, we're done. And then now we're to tell a story about Jesus and Peter, right? It just,
Yeah,
huh? Where did this come from? So when you talk about that editor, yeah, there definitely seems to be more going on here than one person writing something down. There seems to be additions to it. Um, and John 7:53 to 8:11 just seems like one of them.
yeah. And you would think if there's an attempt to like what's the word, conceal that this is an edited book, right? We would move that section to the conclusion, right? And not just tape onto the scroll this new part, right?
Yeah, yeah. There's definitely something to, again, we perceive ancient texts differently than, or sacred texts, sorry, differently than they did. But of course, there's a question of whether they believed it to be a sacred text when they were writing it, or is that something that we deemed afterwards, um, to either deem it or recognize its its inspiration or sacredness. That's a bigger conversation, though. And well, I am
Yeah.
far from qualified to to speak on at any high level.
Yeah. Yeah, where I mean you can see where some of the writing is just so good how people would think that, right? Because it's just kind of works on so many levels. Where like I can see how people would think First Thessalonians is inspired because of the how complex the writing is, right? The parallels that we are drawing from, and it's never even stated. And then we have the chiasmi, which just seems so like intricate that it looks like he's just speaking off the cuff, but clearly not, right? Because it's just so mathematical how it works. And then also how people believe that Second Thessalonians is not written by Paul because it seems like a child's letter to Santa compared to First, right? Like, what happened there, Paul? Like, I don't know. We can see why something's off with it,
Yeah,
but
it
yeah,
definitely makes you wonder how, like, if we just take that it's Pauline, like, what's the difference? Why is there a difference? Is it simply the scribe? Is it you had less, the famous Mark Twain quote? So that's may or may not, probably isn't Mark Twain. I would have written a shorter letter, but I didn't have the time. Um, like, how does that work? So it's interesting to contemplate those kind of things. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. All right, so this seems like a good place to start winding down. Did you have any more thoughts that we didn't get to?
Oh, I've got tons of thoughts on this topic.
Good
Probably not.
answer. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. All right. Yeah, would you want to leave it there or
That
any?
sounds good to me. I don't have anything else that is again related to this topic that really pushes. So yeah, I hope that I hope that, if anything else, whoever's listening or watching just takes the time to look at that section. Go read all of John. Well, go read all the Book of Signs. Maybe ignore the farewell discourse. It's long and not as much fun sometimes. But go read the Book of Signs and really dive into it. And those first 12 chapters, there's so much there that we barely scratched the surface. And make those connections for yourself. See what John is doing. It is it is Hebrew literature at its height. Um, that it's just a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and everybody check out. They might be doing another episode here this week. Barely Saved podcast.
The
And
archives are still there, so you can go hear us be silly about what the craziest one I think was the nuns on the party boat saving the kayaker. I think that's like episode 12. It might be one of my favorite silly little
yeah,
stories. So yeah, definitely something to go check out.
yeah, absolutely. All right. Thank you. Thank you for coming on, and thank you everybody for watching. Have an awesome rest of the day here.
I